what we see right now is Trump putting these two very close U.S. Arab allies in a position of extreme insecurity in order to really fulfill the fantasies of the most right-wing extremists in Israel. Obviously, with the fall of the Assad regime, we saw Russia and Iran suffer a huge loss, and Moscow and Tehran's influence in Syria has drastically fallen. And that's created a void which is largely being filled by Turkey. The big external winner from regime change in Syria is Turkey. The GCC states are pragmatic in terms of accepting who is in power in Damascus and trying to make the most of the situation. I think most of these expatriate jihadists in Syria kind of have their eyes on Russia and China, not really the West. So perhaps the Trump administration will not see it as that much of an issue.
Hello everyone, I'm Rania Khalek and this is Dispatches. After years of war and foreign intervention, a post-Assad Syria is taking shape, one that's redefining alliances and rivalries across the Middle East. Gulf states, Turkey, and even Israel are recalibrating, while the US and Russia assess their next moves. Some longtime players like Iran and Hezbollah are facing new challenges after losing influence, while others, like Israel, have quickly expanded their foothold, particularly in the occupied Golan Heights. What does this mean for the balance of power in the region? At the same time, Donald Trump is causing even more drama by threatening to cut off aid to Egypt and Jordan if they refuse to take in Palestinians ethnically cleansed from Gaza. For decades, these governments have resisted such a scenario, fearing it would destabilize their own countries. But with Trump pushing harder than ever, could his threats force them to shift their position? Or will this create new tensions between Washington and its Arab allies? To discuss this and other regional developments, I'm joined by Giorgio Cafiero, the CEO of Gulf State Analytics, a Washington, D.C.-based geopolitical risk consultancy. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The full interview is available to Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Giorgio, welcome back to Dispatches.
Good to be with you.
It's always a pleasure to have you on, and we have so much to get into. You have been very busy. You've been writing so much and putting out so many articles about all of the seismic shifts we've seen across the region, particularly since the changing government in Syria, which was a pretty dramatic difference. But before we get into Syria, which I think is going to be most of what we're talking about, I want to touch on the issue of Gaza because that's in the news right now. And obviously, Trump's got his big supposed, peace plan, attempting to quote unquote clean out Gaza of Palestinians, just blatant ethnic cleansing. He wants the Palestinians in Gaza to be displaced, ethnically cleansed into Egypt and Jordan. And this isn't the first time this idea, by the way, has been floated. I just want to point out that there was a period in the beginning of the genocide in Gaza when the Biden administration and and officials in it were actually going to Egypt and Jordan trying to see if they'd take any Palestinians. But obviously Trump is being more bullish about it. And now he's threatening to cut aid to Egypt and Jordan if they don't take in Palestinians, who he wants to ethnically cleanse from Gaza. Now, these countries have long seen the displacement of Palestinians into their territory as a security threat, rather than a humanitarian issue, of course. They're adamantly opposed to this idea. Can you explain why Egypt and Jordan are so opposed to this? I mean, beyond just their public rhetoric. And do you think Trump's threats of aid cuts could actually force them to shift their position? Or is this more about domestic posturing?
Yeah, these are some really important questions you're asking here. The leadership in Cairo and Amman have so much at stake when it comes to these dynamics that we're discussing right here. I think it's important for everyone to sort of see this issue of forced displacement of Palestinians within a historical context. Back in 1947, 1948, there was the Nakba, leading up to the establishment of Israel as an independent nation state. And at that time, before Israel was the state, so really the Zionist settlers, Zionist gangs in historic Palestine forced out hundreds of thousands of Palestinians at gunpoint, and they went into Egypt, Jordan, and other neighboring Arab countries, and they were never allowed to return, bringing us to the beginning of the Palestinian refugee crisis. There is an understanding in the region that if Trump's plan, which, by the way, is totally unrealistic, but if it were to be implemented, and if the Egyptian and Jordanian governments were to partner and cooperate with Trump in the execution of that plan, there's this understanding that those Palestinians would never return to Palestine. So the population, the citizens of the region understand that this would amount to a Nakba 2.0. For any Arab leader to be complicit in that would amount to political suicide. And something that many experts have been pointing out is that if the Egyptian or Jordanian governments were to cooperate with this plan and allow hundreds of thousands or millions of Palestinians into their territory, that could easily spell the fall of the leaders of Egypt and Jordan. So when we talk about their opposition to Trump's plan, this goes to the heart of regime survival issues in Egypt and Jordan. Now, the stability of Egypt and Jordan is so important to other countries, including those in the Gulf Cooperation Council, that we have seen all the Arab governments come together and give support to Egypt and Jordan and issue very firm statements with strong language stating that Trump's plan is 100% unacceptable. Now, Trump is talking about cutting off aid to Egypt and Jordan. There's no doubt that those two countries, which very much depend on Washington's economic and military support, would suffer a lot from such a permanent severance of U.S. aid. But they made it very clear that they would accept that before they would accept Trump's plan. So what we see right now is Trump putting these two very close U.S. Arab allies in a position of extreme insecurity in order to really fulfill the fantasies of the most right-wing extremists in Israel who have spent decades talking about this idea that there should be a Palestinian state, but it should belong in Jordan. Or recently, Netanyahu made a comment, even if jokingly so, suggesting that the Palestinian state should exist on Saudi land. Just to be clear, this is not a new idea. What is new is to have a U.S. president in such an open manner advocating for this quote unquote solution to the Palestinian issue.
Yeah, it really is incredible. And it's I think, a pattern with so many of the policies Trump wants to implement, where on the one hand, he's trying to make deals and act like this big bully, but it's kind of shooting American imperialism in the foot, because to cut off aid would make those countries insecure. To actually ethnically cleanse Palestinians into their territory would make them even more insecure in terms of their regimes. So it's definitely interesting to watch. And you mentioned something very important, and that's that the security of Egypt and Jordan is something that many of the Gulf states are heavily invested in, the stability of those regimes. So Saudi Arabia and the UAE have positioned themselves, and they are to a great degree, they're key regional players, right? Especially when it comes to the U.S. and these growing ties with the Israelis. So where do these Gulf states stand on Trump's push to relocate? And relocate's a very whitewashed word, to ethnically cleanse Palestinians from Gaza. Do they also see this? It sounds like what you're saying. They see this as a red line. Or is there a possibility they could quietly support it in exchange for leverage elsewhere? And the reason I ask that is because I could imagine that the Trump administration, or some people in it, are wise enough to recognize that they would have to give the Gulf states something pretty big to make them, dismiss something that also seems like a red line for them.
For a couple of reasons, I do not see the GCC states coming around to supporting Trump's plan. There's questions maybe we can get to later about what it is they could actually do about it. And we can certainly acknowledge that to some extent there are real limits on their leverage here. But the plan that Trump keeps on talking about would be so dangerous from the standpoint of Gulf security. I cannot see any of the 6 GCC states supporting it. If we would consider a scenario whereby there is state collapse in Egypt or Jordan, and that is totally a scenario worth considering if you were to talk about, 1 million Palestinians coming into Jordan or Egypt, that would probably spill into the Gulf and create huge crises for the GCC leaders. Right now, the Gulf states are really focused on their internal economic development and diversification. They need to end their economic dependence on gas and oil. So they're trying to grow non-hydrocarbon sectors of the economy. We see, like in Saudi Arabia, there's the ambitious Vision 2030. They need to bring in a ton of investment. They need to bring in many tourists. To do all of this, they need stability at home and in the neighborhood. So Trump's plan, it's a huge threat to the ability of these GCC states to achieve these economic transformations that they're so focused on right now. They want peace and stability above all else. And they really see Trump's plan as extremely dangerous. And they are trying to come together, not just the 6 GCC states, but really all the Arab League members are trying to come together and speak with a collective voice, believing that if they act collectively, that can have more of an influence on the White House rather than having individual Arab states reaching out to the Trump administration. So that's really what the focus is for leaders of the GCC countries right now.
And real quick, before we go into what their leverage could be to prevent this, I wanted to could you very, very briefly explain, because it's always kind of said without explanation, why would the ethnic cleansing of 1 million Palestinians into Egypt and then another 1 million into Jordan, why would this lead to state collapse? Why is that the fear?
Well, the Palestinian issue is one that is very important to the societies in Egypt, Jordan, and all Arab countries. The memories of the 1947, 1948 Nakba remain very vivid in the minds of the people in this region. And as I said, if there were to be cooperation from the Egyptian or Jordanian governments with Trump's plan, the citizens of Egypt and Jordan would view that as their leaders being complicit with sort of a Nakba 2.0. This would create a huge legitimacy crisis for President Sisi in Egypt and King Abdullah in Jordan. These countries already have many serious economic problems, other sources of instability at home. And so this could really push these countries over the edge. I think perceptions of these leaders being a partner of some sort of Nakba 2.0 agenda could definitely result in them falling, because there would be so much backlash from their own citizens. Throughout the 15 to 16 months of the genocide in Gaza, there were very powerful emotions in Egypt, and Jordan, and also all the other Arab countries too. So something like this coming so soon after this very recent war in Gaza would have an explosive impact on both of these countries.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I also imagine that to some degree, if you look historically at Palestinian displacement, and after being ethnically cleansed out of historic Palestine, whether it's into Jordan, into Lebanon, into Egypt, it's likely you would have some sort of attempt to hit back at Israel from those territories, because you've seen that in the past. So I imagine that would be something. Let's say if you're going to have, like for the Egyptians, if you're going to have a bunch of Palestinians from Gaza pushed into the Sinai, you could very quickly have like Hamas militias in the Sinai. That's something that the Egyptians would never be okay with, because of course they're very anti-Hamas and anti-Muslim Brotherhood. But I would imagine there's also a fear of the sort of refugee issue that comes along with being ethnically cleansed that would create in terms of armed resistance from their territories, I guess is what I'm saying.
It's a very, very important point you're making. You're spot on here. I think from, for example, the Egyptian government standpoint, they realize that Palestinian militancy is a natural outcome of the occupation. But the Egyptian government with its own peace treaty with Israel, which prevents Israel from going to war with Egypt, and it also ensures all this American economic support for Egypt. That's a peace treaty that the Egyptian government wants to maintain, and they want to see that Palestinian militancy exist in Gaza, but not on Egyptian soil. In the event that all these Palestinians in Gaza are ethnically cleansed and forced into the Sinai, the militancy would just take place from the Sinai. And that puts the Egyptian authorities in a very difficult position whereby they'd have to decide, they have to make very difficult decisions. They would either preserve their peace treaty with Israel and crush the militants in the Sinai, which would create a huge backlash from the Egyptian population, which would be in solidarity with the militants, or they could allow the Hamas militants to operate from the Sinai and have the peace treaty with Israel go to waste. And then Egypt would potentially face backlash from the Israeli military, which could do a tremendous amount of damage to Israel. Obviously, Israel has a military that's far superior to Egypt's military, and Egypt does not want to enter into some war with Israel.
Yeah. So, and I also should caveat all of this with that we're having this conversation on Thursday, February 13th. So in a couple of days, we'll see if the ceasefire in Gaza holds. There's a lot of signs that it could very quickly fall apart. But that said, to go back to the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, do, of course, want to push back on this plan for the very reasons you explained. So how might they leverage their influence with Trump? Would economic incentives or arms deals or geopolitical concessions perhaps come into play? And then also, could this impact broader U.S. Gulf relations, especially since because of Trump's transactional approach to foreign policy? And what I'm thinking of here is the impact this could have, for example, on this U.S. dream of Saudi-Israel normalization.
Yeah, well, obviously the Gulf states had 4 years of experience dealing with Trump during his first term. So they definitely, have a lot of practice when it comes to trying to persuade Trump of this or persuade him of that. I think they sort of realized that one way to kind of bring Trump around to their side, frankly, it's through kind of cajoling him, praising him, flattering him, and they're kind of trying that right now. And also you saw this from the King of Jordan. The message to Trump is, we're so grateful you're in the White House. We know that you want peace. You're in a unique position to be an American president who brings peace. We agree that Gaza has a lot of potential. We just think that sort of your energy needs to be channeled in sort of this direction. And when we find a solution to Gaza, it needs to work for the Palestinians and the Arab states too. So we really like, your energy and your plans for peace. We just want you to kind of move things in this direction. So they don't want a confrontation or any tension with him. They're sort of trying to, as I said, kind of cajole and flatter him into sort of changing course a little bit. They also understand that he's a very transactional president. Trump makes foreign policy decisions really based upon who's the highest bidder, and the Gulf states do have their lobbies here in Washington. And I have no doubt that especially Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar are going to use their lobbies in Washington to try to persuade the Trump administration to not go ahead with these types of plans that involve displacing millions of Palestinians. They're going to try to push the Trump administration to be in favor of more moderate positions, to be more in line with the Arab Peace Initiative. And they also have economic cards to play. The GCC states are huge investors in the U.S. economy. Really, going back to the recession of 2008, 2009, the U.S. economy got out of that recession in no small part due to investments of Gulf Arab sovereign wealth funds in the American economy. And Trump is very big on, securing lucrative deals, bringing in foreign investment into the U.S. So Gulf states definitely have some cards to play when it comes to, finance, investment, and trade. So I think they're going to certainly try to use that leverage. And at the same time, Trump is going to be turning to the Gulf states on a whole host of other issues as the Trump administration is trying to freeze the war in Ukraine. GCC states are probably set to play an important role in the diplomacy there. when it comes to other regional issues like Red Sea security, Iran, so on and so forth. Trump is going to be asking GCC states for help. So, there certainly is some leverage that the Gulf Arab countries have. Whether they're going to succeed in convincing Trump to move away from this very deranged plan for Gaza, I don't know. But they very much see it in their interests to convince Trump to change course and not impose an agenda on the region that leaves the GCC states and Egypt and Jordan facing extremely serious security threats. Now, to get to your question about Saudi-Israeli normalization, I mean, people continue to talk about this like it's a real possibility. You see articles always being published with different folks talking about the entry of Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accords is something that's just on the verge of happening, something that can happen any day now. I mean, this type of assessment is so out of touch with reality. I think that Trump's rhetoric and also Netanyahu's comment about a Palestinian state existing inside the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, this inflammatory rhetoric has even further minimized any chance of Saudi Arabia entering the Abraham Accords. If anything, this rhetoric from Trump and Netanyahu of the past few weeks has resulted in Saudi Arabia doubling down on its position that it's maintained since the kingdom set forth the Arab Peace Initiative back in 2002, which is very clear. It says that there will be normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, as well as all the other Arab states in Israel, in the event that there's a two-state solution based on the 1967 borders with an independent Palestinian state that has its capital in East Jerusalem. We've seen from Saudi officials, Saudi elites, Saudi state-run media in the past few weeks a real doubling down on this position. It's sort of made support for the two-state solution and support for Palestinian rights increasingly central to Saudi Arabia's foreign policy purpose in the past few weeks. So, I mean, point being, we're moving further and further away from any possibility of Saudi-Israeli normalization. And I'll just add, there were some people in the Trump administration who suggested that because of the ceasefire in Gaza that went into effect on January 19th, that alone was going to open the door to Saudi-Israeli normalization. I mean, don't get me wrong, the Saudi leadership very much welcomed that ceasefire and saw it as an important step. But still, that's very, very short of resolving the Palestinian issue and bringing us to Palestinian statehood. That's what the Saudis will need to see before they would sign a peace or a diplomatic deal with Israel. And we are really, really far away from that now. The type of concessions that Israel would have to make to the Palestinians for Saudi Arabia to normalize with Tel Aviv are ones that we simply cannot imagine this current Israeli government making.
Yeah, and we'll have to, of course, wait and see how that continues to play out. But I think you make some very important points that are lost on many people who I think are a little bit blinded by wishful thinking.
Yeah.
I want to pivot to the issue of Syria. But first, I just want to note, I think something that we learned from the last year and a half of genocide in Gaza is that for the most part, what happens in Gaza doesn't threaten the stability of these countries and regimes, but the U.S., a leader like Trump, basically making Gaza the problem of surrounding countries is what's threatening those regimes. So it's interesting to see that play out. As long as it's contained to Gaza, which is horrible, it seems like everybody's just willing to shrug their shoulders and look the other way, or even help the Israelis accomplish their plan. But at the end of the day, there are 2 million Palestinians, depending on how many were killed, of course, that are still in Gaza. They still exist, and they're not just going to disappear. So we'll see how long they can just keep it, I guess, contained to this small strip of land called Gaza. But moving on to the issue of Syria, Giorgio, and I mean, the last time I talked to you, there was a different government in charge in Syria. So much has changed since December 8th with the change in regime from the Assad regime to now the Ahmed al-Shara regime. And we're still kind of watching the dust settle inside Syria, but it has certainly very, very quickly changed the dynamics of the region. So let's start with the way that the GCC states and Turkey are navigating this new Syria. And I guess we can start with Turkey because I think that's probably the most important country with relation to Syria. So can you break down for our audience the significance of the Turkish-Syrian relationship? You know, Turkey played a very crucial role in bringing Ahmed al-Shara, formerly Mohammed al-Jolani, to power, and Turkey is now positioned to benefit pretty tremendously, militarily, economically, and regionally from this change in government. You know, some see neo-Ottoman aspirations here. But go ahead. I'm going to give you the floor to explain to us the Turkey dynamic when it comes to Syria.
Yeah, well, obviously with the fall of the Assad regime, we saw Russia and Iran suffer a huge loss, and Moscow and Tehran's influence in Syria has drastically fallen, and that's created a void which is largely being filled by Turkey. As of now, I think it's very safe to say that the big winner from regime change, the big external winner from regime change in Syria is Turkey. And the Turks, as you noted, were supportive of Syrian opposition groups going back to the start of the Syrian crisis in 2011, 2012. And the leadership in Ankara, I think, feels that the fall of Assad sort of vindicated the Turkish foreign policy position in support of anti-Assad militias in Syria. And now Turkey is in a position to really benefit from the rise of HTS and other rebel groups that successfully toppled the Assad regime late last year. At this point, Turkey sees itself gaining a lot from a security standpoint, a geopolitical standpoint, and an economic standpoint from the new reality in Syria. The number one security concern that Turkey has in Syria relates to the US-backed YPG in northeastern Syria. This group is, from the Turkish perspective, just the Syrian offshoot of the PKK. And in Turkey, for decades, there has been a widespread perception of the PKK posing nothing short of an existential threat to the Turkish state. So the Turks have long wanted to see the YPG eradicated or at least disarmed in northeastern Syria. The view from Ankara is that these changes in Syria make this much more likely and much more possible. So Turkey is trying to work with the new authorities in Damascus and also some other Arab militias in northern Syria that are backed by Turkey to weaken the position of YPG and eventually sort of disarm YPG and integrate it into the Syrian state. Turkey very much wants to see Syria have a unitary state. They do not want to see autonomous armed groups that are linked to the PKK controlling territory, especially oil-rich territory in northeastern Syria. And al-Shara is in agreement with Ankara on this point. So again, Turkey sees the fall of Assad as a unique opportunity to really address what it sees as the threat of YPG-related terrorism inside Syria. At the same time, so much of Syria is in absolute ruins right now. For the country to redevelop, there is going to have to be so much reconstruction. And I think a lot of Turkish companies in manufacturing, transport, and construction sectors see huge opportunities to make a massive amount of money in the upcoming 10 years or so when it comes to these huge, large-scale redevelopment projects in Syria. Ultimately, what we have is sort of a unique situation from the Turkish standpoint. There is sort of an Ankara-oriented pro-Turkish government in Damascus. It's been a really long time since there has been one. And so Turkey views this as a very unique opportunity to assert more Turkish influence in the Levant and by extension, the Arab world at large. Having said all of this, there are also some ways in which developments could unfold in Syria that harm Turkey's interests. There's obviously so much uncertainty when it comes to the future of Syria. The HTS-dominated government in Damascus has not yet cemented control over the entire country. There are significant portions of Syria that are not under the control of the new government in Damascus. And we have to, of course, consider that, especially with crippling US and European sanctions on Syria, we might see that economic development and effective governance are obstructed, and there could be a failure of the new Syrian state to cement its control over the country. We have to consider the possibility of state collapse in Syria. The economy is in absolutely horrible shape. We don't know if the US is going to remove the Caesar Act sanctions. If the Caesar Act sanctions stay on Syria, it will be very difficult to imagine Syria redeveloping. And if Syria is a place that is just not livable for Syrians, we could see more refugees from Syria going back into Turkey. There's also potential for power vacuums to emerge in Syria when we consider the possibility of state collapse and weak governance. This could give rise to non-state actors such as Islamic State who have attacked Turkey in the past. So in short, I would say Turkey is very optimistic about what can happen in these upcoming years in Syria. Ankara sees very valuable opportunities to gain from all the changes in Syria. They really see this as Turkey's unique moment, but they do have concerns about some of the dynamics in Syria. And basically it comes down to Turkish concerns about Syria being sort of a weak or a collapsed state in the future.
Right. Yeah, I mean, well, it's definitely very much wait and see in Syria. And like you mentioned about the economy, I mean, there's also the fact that Syria at this point has just been flooded with goods. So it's from outside. And so that's also caused apparently economic issues in terms of the affordability. And I'm obvious, I mean, it's, just because there's a change in government that certain Western powers might like doesn't mean, like you said, the sanctions just disappear tomorrow. They still haven't been removed, and those sanctions were meant to cripple Syria. So Syria is still crippled. So remains to be seen. I want to move on from Turkey, though, to the issue of the Gulf states. And they've had, sort of shifting positions when it comes to Syria. When it comes to engaging with Syria as well, because, when Assad was still in power the last couple of years, you had seen a kind of normalization with some of the Gulf states that actually played a role in trying to overthrow him and funding and arming an insurgency. And they had reasons for sort of like trying to make nice with Assad after that didn't work. But obviously now there's a new regime in power. So can you give us an overview of how countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the Qataris are positioning themselves in this so-called new Syria? And perhaps specifically we could focus on first Saudi Arabia and the UAE, because they've been very cautious because of their disdain for the Muslim Brotherhood. But so far, they've also recognized in a very pragmatic way the new government. And Ahmed al-Shadah's first foreign visit was to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I think when we talk about the ways in which GCC states responded to the fall of Assad late last year and the new reality taking shape in post-Assad Syria, we have to realize that GCC states are being very pragmatic. And this is also how they were when Assad was in power and it seemed like he had survived the conflict. The GCC states are pragmatic in terms of accepting who is in power in Damascus and trying to make the most of the situation. And there were different perspectives that different GCC states had on the fall of Assad. They were in some ways optimistic about what could come from the fall of Assad, and also there were concerns about the implications of the Assad regime falling to Islamist rebels. But what they have done is, what they did immediately after Assad fell was to reach out to the new rulers in Damascus and to establish dialogue and to signal that GCC states were going to be supportive of Syria maintaining its territorial integrity, of seeing to it that Syria would not become a country where groups like ISIS could reemerge, and trying to support the Syrian people in moving ahead with a political transition to the post-Assad period. The GCC countries really saw after October 7th the extent to which conflict in the Middle East is so contagious. We saw the war in Gaza spill into the Red Sea, spill into Lebanon and Syria, and that terrified the GCC states, which want to promote stability in the neighborhood, again, in line with their own sort of vision for economic development and diversification. So their main concerns in Syria have to do with the possibility of chaos and instability in Syria spilling into other countries such as Jordan and then into the Gulf. So their main priority is, as I said, stability above all else inside Syria. Now, at the same time, some of the GCC countries, especially UAE and also Saudi Arabia, had huge concerns about the implications of HTS taking power in Damascus. The GCC states are, for the most part, conservative monarchies that support a status quo order in the region. They tend to be against radical revolutionary ideas that can spread from one Arab country to another. So their biggest concern was that al-Shara's new government in Damascus would promote revolutionary Islamist ideas and try to inspire Arabs in the Gulf and Arabs all over the region to take inspiration from the rise of HTS. So they have tried to use their influence in Syria to pressure the new government in Damascus to not meddle in the affairs of Gulf states and to make HTS's agenda limited to Syria and to avoid any sort of revolutionary foreign policy agenda. Now, there's a lot that the new Syrian government needs from the GCC states, and I think al-Shara, to his credit, is proven to be very shrewd and very pragmatic. And his message to the GCC states has been that the HTS-dominated government has no interest in spreading revolution to other Arab countries, and he has gone to pains to emphasize that the new government in Damascus will not pose any threat to the geopolitical or security interests of GCC states. He has also won quite a bit of favor with the Saudis in emphasizing that he will not have the same relationship, his government will not have the same relationship with Iran and Hezbollah that the Assad government had with Iran and the Lebanese group. That has done quite a bit to also comfort the leadership in Saudi Arabia and view regime change in Syria more positively. I think, though, the one GCC state that is most cautious when dealing with the new government in Syria is the UAE. The UAE did a lot to shore up the Assad government, really beginning in late 2018. The UAE welcomed Assad into Abu Dhabi and Dubai beginning in March 2022. High-ranking Emirati officials were going to Damascus, meeting with Assad regime officials. The UAE was sort of a hub for Arab renormalization, with Syria hosting conferences aimed at generating more support from Gulf Arab states for the reconstruction of Syria. The UAE did a lot to advocate for bringing Syria back into the Arab League that happened in May of 2023. So when Assad fell, I think the UAE was really the GCC state that perceived that to more than any other GCC state, the UAE really perceived that as a loss. The UAE is also very terrified. The UAE's leadership is very terrified of Islamist groups, and seeing an organization like HTS come to power in an Arab country like Syria, certainly something that unsettles the UAE. But I think the UAE has also tried to make the most of the situation, and the foreign minister of Syria visited Abu Dhabi. It was the third country he visited after Assad fell. First, he went to Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Then he came to Abu Dhabi. So clearly there's an interest in engagement between the new Syrian government and the UAE. The new Syrian government needs as much investment and economic assistance as possible, and they're not in a position to turn down any Emirati support that might come later. And I think the UAE believes that its ability to give economic, financial support to Syria can serve to influence al-Shara's government in ways that bode positively for the UAE's interests. So there, I think, is a lack of trust between Abu Dhabi and the Islamist authorities in Damascus, but they're both engaging each other very pragmatically. I will also add here that we saw in other countries during the post-Arab Spring period, such as Egypt and Libya, that when Islamists came to power, the UAE was involved in a counter-revolutionary agenda to topple the Islamists or to push back against them. We saw that with the 2013 overthrow of Mohamed Morsi in Egypt, and then with the rise of General Haftar in Libya and the outbreak of the Libyan civil war in 2014. So I think the HTS-dominated government in Syria is very worried that possibly at some point Abu Dhabi would try to back some sort of a coup in Syria to remove al-Shara from power. So I think his government is trying to engage the Emiratis and give them a stake in the success and the survival of the new Syrian government, in the hopes that that will prevent the UAE from being behind some sort of counter-revolutionary agenda in the new Syria.
If you have a conscience, it's unbearable to be plugged into the corporate media machine right now. These outlets are accomplices in genocide, running cover for the war machine. Breakthrough has become the go-to outlet for those who want something different. But the funds we've used to start this platform are starting to run out. We'd never dream of turning to mainstream corporate funding. So we're turning to you. Become a patron. For as little as $5 a month, you can become an essential part of our fight to not just break through the mainstream media, but create something that can challenge it. We have to become completely viewer supported, or this platform we've built could go away. Don't just watch us, join us.
So I think that an interesting player here as well is the Qataris, who have a very different position on all of this. And of course, the Qataris played a pretty big role in Syria pre-Shara. I don't even know what to call all these different eras, but during the Assad era, during the post-2011 era, Qatar played a huge role in the insurgency. The Qataris were major backers of Jolani himself and of Nusra, the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. And so this is a big win for them as well. And they're also quite aligned with Turkey. They have that, Muslim Brotherhood ideology within their royal family. So where will they position themselves from here? And what I find interesting is obviously Turkey's front and center when it comes to Syria, but the Qataris haven't been so much, not that because they're upset or not happy with the new Syrian government, but just, they've been more in the background on this. So where do the Qataris stand?
It's a great question. I'll just say on a personal note, I was in Doha when the Assad government fell, so I certainly had a unique look at the situation. You're absolutely right that the Qatari position is kind of unique. Not only did Qatar support Syrian rebel groups early on in the crisis, but the Amir's father, who was Amir at the time, even advocated sending Arab military forces into Syria to overthrow Assad, I believe, as early as 2012. And the Qataris put a tremendous amount of money into different militias that were fighting the Assad regime early on in the conflict. And then when the general trend in the Arab world was toward renormalizing relations with Assad, the Qataris never joined that movement toward renormalization. Qatar did stop to directly arm rebel groups in Syria when it became clear that the Russian intervention had sort of cemented Assad's position in power, at least for a number of years. The Qataris sort of gave up efforts to be directly involved in efforts to overthrow Assad, but they always maintained their position that the regime had lost legitimacy. Qatar was really the one member of the Arab League that continued to view the Syrian opposition as the legitimate representative of Syria. And so when the Assad government fell late last year, it was really a vindicating moment for Doha. The Qatari leaders said for a long time that there would never be stability in Syria with Assad in power, and that, or at least if there were to be a return of stability, the Assad regime would have to make a number of concessions to the opposition that were complete non-starters for the Assad regime. So the Qatari line was that the status quo in Syria was not sustainable and that renormalizing relations with Assad's government would not be productive. So when he fell, it was kind of a sort of an I told you so moment for Qatar. They really felt that that confirmed that they had been on the right side of history. And because of these links to rebel groups that you were mentioning, the Qataris were in a unique position to sort of gain a lot of influence in the new Syria. At the same time, though, the Qataris are responding to the new reality in Syria in a very cautious way. As I'm sure your listeners remember, back in 2017, there was a blockade that a few Arab countries, chiefly UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Egypt, imposed on Qatar. And that was in large part a response to Doha's pro-Muslim Brotherhood and what they perceived as a pro-Muslim Brotherhood and sort of Islamist-friendly foreign policy that Qatar had for a number of years. And they tried very hard to isolate Qatar as a consequence of its foreign policy that they saw as supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood. And that blockade ended in 2021. And since the blockade ended, Doha has gone to pains to ensure that it is on good terms with its fellow GCC members, especially Saudi Arabia. And officials in Doha are trying to deal with the situation in Syria in a way that does not result in other GCC states feeling threatened by Qatar's actions in relation to Syria. So the Qataris are actually sort of sitting back and allowing Saudi Arabia to be the GCC state that takes the lead when it comes to engaging the new Syrian government. And the Qataris are making sure, like I said, that they're not doing anything in relation to post-Assad Syria that is causing concern in other Arab capitals. They're trying to work in a cooperative way with other Arab states. There definitely is going to be a lot of cooperation between Qatar and Turkey. I think in general, the Qataris are quite optimistic about what can come out of this regime change in Syria, whereas the UAE is tending to view the situation from a threat prism. I think the Qataris are really looking at the new Syria as sort of something from more the prism of opportunity. But that being said, the concerns that all the GCC states have about the situation in Syria are ones that the Qataris share as well. The Qataris have been very outspoken about Israel's aggression against post-Assad Syria. We've seen the Israelis bombarding Damascus, other parts of Syria since Assad fell. There's been more land theft in Syria. And the Qataris believe that what Israel is doing in Syria threatens the political transition. And Qatar has been very outspoken in condemning these Israeli actions, as have the other GCC states. At the same time, Qatar is obviously concerned about the implications of the US and the European Union maintaining sanctions on Syria. If these sanctions stay in place, the Gulf Arab states are not going to be able to invest in Syria's future. And they all think that investing in the reconstruction of Syria is necessary for stabilizing Syria. But these sanctions that the US imposes on Syria are secondary. And therefore, even non-US based entities that would violate the sanctions could be punished by the US Treasury. These Gulf Arab states invest a lot in the US economy. And so they are not going to invest in Syria as long as the Caesar Act is still in place. And the concern that Qatar has and other GCC states have is that if the Caesar Act remains in place, Syria can kind of become sort of an economic void, sort of an economic black hole in the Middle East, where you have illegal trade taking place and you have power vacuums that can be filled by dangerous groups such as ISIS. All of this is to say, while there's quite a bit of optimism in Doha about Syria's future, there are also some very serious concerns. It's not just, one big celebration.
Yeah, and I mean, there's still so much I want to touch on here, and I want to talk to you about the plans of the Trump administration. I want to talk to you about the Iranian loss in Syria, the Israeli gains in Syria. I want to get into what this means for countries like China and Russia, Russia being another country that lost pretty big in Syria. But I think a good place to move from what you were just talking about is the Trump administration, because one of these big questions is how he will approach Syria, particularly HTS, with regard to the sanctions. And there have been whispers that Trump's team, or some people on Trump's team, would love to delist HTS. There's Republicans in Congress who would love to delist HTS, who would love to lift the sanctions tomorrow. But, it's interesting because Tulsi Gabbard just got appointed or approved for head of the Defense National Intelligence or Department of National Intelligence.
Director of National Intelligence.
Thank you, Director of National Intelligence, DNI, too many acronyms. But she's now the Director of National Intelligence, which is a huge job. And you saw at her confirmation hearing, people were having a meltdown because she was asked about her prior position on Syria. And she actually held her ground on that and explained her view on what she feels about the new government in charge, and that she basically views them as al-Qaeda. And this is the reason she joined the military after 9/11 and on and on and on. And we all know Tulsi Gabbard got huge backlash for the fact that she came out very vehemently against the U.S. attempt to overthrow the Assad regime by arming and funding a collection of these al-Qaeda affiliated groups. And everybody called her a Putin stooge, an Assad stooge because of that. And now she's Director of National Intelligence. I'm not sure, how much influence it's necessarily going to have on Trump's decisions, but it will have some level of influence. So all that said, with all those contradictions, what do you think is going to be the strategy when it comes to Syria from the Trump administration?
Not as see this as an opportunity for a new geopolitical order to emerge in the Middle East, whereby Iran, Hezbollah, and others in the axis of resistance are much weaker. This is very positive from their standpoint. At the same time, many of these figures in the Trump administration are extremely suspicious of HTS, where it came from, the way in which it rose to power, very suspicious about what might be the long-term intentions that al-Shara and others in the new Syrian government have for the country. I think the Trump administration is trying to be very cautious when dealing with the new Syrian government and taking really a wait-and-see approach. The two real big questions here have to do with the possibility of delisting HTS, which is an organization listed on the State Department's foreign terrorist organization list. Without delisting HTS, Washington and the government in Damascus will have a very complicated relationship, and engagement between the two will be very complicated in many ways. Then, of course, there's the Caesar Act sanctions. The Caesar Act sanctions were at least the official reason for their implementation back during Trump 1.0 was to go after the Assad government. Now that government is out of the picture, but the Caesar Act sanctions remain in place. And so there's this sensitive debate here in Washington about whether or not to remove the Caesar Act sanctions or not. I think on both of these issues, the delisting of HTS and the Caesar Act, the Trump administration is going to move very slowly. I don't think the Trump administration is going to be in a rush to do anything to fully legitimize HTS and the new government in Syria. I think there are a few factors in play that will matter a lot to the Trump administration. This is an administration, just like the previous one, that is very pro-Israel, and what it deems to be beneficial to Israel is always central to its considerations toward any country in the Middle East. I think if the new Syrian government would be confrontational toward Israel, that would dim any prospects for the Trump administration delisting HTS or lifting the Caesar Act sanctions. I think al-Shara understands that, and I think that's a main reason why he has chosen to not confront Israel. There are other reasons too, but I think him trying to be seen as legitimate by the Trump administration is one reason why he is not really doing anything to forcefully respond to Israel's aggression.
Right.
Then when we talk about religious minorities, to be very blunt with you, I think the Trump administration, they really care about the status of Christians in Syria, but I don't think the potential mistreatment of other minority groups, especially Alawites in Syria, matters much to the Trump team. I think any oppression of Alawites would be seen as sort of retribution for the Assad regime's crimes. But people in the Trump administration, like J.D. Vance, when they talk about issues in the Arab world, they put a lot of emphasis on the plight of Christians. So I think if you were to see the new Syrian government be tied to some sort of massacre of Christians in the country, that would really decrease the chances of the Trump administration delisting HTS or removing the Caesar Act sanctions. I also think they want to see how the new government interacts with Iran and Hezbollah. I think al-Shara has made it very clear that Syria is not to be a country that allows Iran and Iran-backed paramilitary groups to operate. That is something the Trump administration probably very much appreciates from him, and they want to see more of that. And then lastly, there has to do with this issue of expatriate jihadists who are in Syria. As I'm sure all your viewers know, within that coalition of rebel groups that overthrew the Assad government, they were not all Syrian rebels. There were fighters from Western China, from the Western Balkans, from Russia, from Central Asia. And we have seen that the new Syrian government has actually put some of those fighters into high-ranking roles in the new Syrian military. I believe some fighters from Xinjiang, the part of Western China, as well as Turkey and Jordan, were put in these positions. The Trump administration is not going to take well to non-Syrians having these positions of power in the new Syrian state. That being said, I think most of these expatriate jihadists in Syria kind of have their eyes on Russia and China, not really the West. So perhaps the Trump administration will not see it as that much of an issue. But again, the presence of these foreign jihadists in Syria and their relationship with the new authorities in Damascus could be a problematic issue from the Trump administration's standpoint. Now, having said all of this, the Gulf states, as we've discussed in this conversation, the Gulf states want to see the U.S. sanctions on Syria lifted immediately. This is the position of all 6 GCC states, and I have no doubt that the Gulf lobbies in Washington are going to push hard on the Trump administration to remove the Caesar Act. Trump has close relationships with Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia and Mohammed bin Zayed in Abu Dhabi. These are 2 Arab leaders who have proven capable of influencing Trump. They are very close to Trump and people within Trump's inner circle. As we mentioned, Trump makes foreign policy decisions based on whoever is the highest bidder. So the Gulf states, realizing that, are going to lobby and try to persuade the Trump administration to lift all the sanctions on Syria. Whether those efforts will be successful or not, I do not know. Very difficult to predict, but I would not dismiss the possibility of Trump's transactional approach to foreign policy resulting in him lifting the sanctions at some point. But for all of these reasons we've been discussing, the picture is very uncertain.
Well, I'm curious if we can also talk about the fact that, under the Biden administration, they had this kind of status quo policy with the sanctions stay in place and obviously zero engagement with Assad. Now, obviously, this is going to shift under Trump to some degree because there's a different regime. But I'm curious if you think that Trump will do something that he has repeatedly said he would do, though it never got done the last time around, which is to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria.
Yeah, so this is a really, really important question, and it actually brings me to another.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.